Okay, so in terms of economic and social change in the Middle Ages, let's start with commerce. Local economic self sufficiency gradually gave way to an interest in goods from other European areas and far flung ports. Like we said in the previous video, crusades helped pave the way for this trend. Lords and their armies of knights brought back fabrics and spices from the east, which generated a larger demand for these foreign goods. And the Silk Roads, even though they were not the same that they were in the Han Dynasty era, and the Tang and the Song for that matter, are still in operation. And also, sea routes across the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean are still in operation. So these places are cut off from one another, but they're still not inaccessible. China also was eager to get involved in cross continental trade. They wanted gold and silver from Europe. And the Europeans in exchange wanted silk, tea, and rhubarb in particular. Europeans at that point were trying to get to the Indies and even farther east, but they kept the only way they could go was around the southern tip of Africa, and they couldn't make their way around the Cape of Good Hope. So instead, they kept going on overland trade routes, and that was becoming increasingly dangerous as the Turkish presence expanded there. Right, so the Crusades only make the forbidden fruit of foreign goods that much sweeter. Uh, Again, I mentioned this in the previous video, but it is Marco Polo's voyages in the late 13th century that also pique the European interest in the Far East. Marco Polo was Italian, he was from Venice, and he visits China actually during the Yuan dynasty, which was a dynasty ruled by Mongols, not the Chinese. But nonetheless, his experience there opens up this window to China that most Europeans knew nothing about. He actually works on Kublai Khan's court when he's there, and he wrote a history of the Mongols, and he described many of their practices. For example, the Mongols engaged in multiple marriages, and they also drank horse milk. So I guess Marco Polo found that to be interesting and wrote about it. So all these people in the West read about Marco Polo's voyages, and they became increasingly curious about the Far Eastern world. In fact, the cartography field, which is map making, exploded after Marco Polo's voyages. In terms of social change, the economic growth has an effect on this, right? So, an increase in commerce caused the development of a small class called the bourgeoisie, uh, or also they're called burghers in some places. They are the middle class. So the social pyramid of Western Europe evolved to have a clergy and nobility at the top. Obviously, the monarch was truly at the top, but he often was a figurehead. Then after that, again, the clergy and the nobility. Then you have this growing number of middle class shopkeepers, merchants, craftspeople, small landowners, making up an increasingly growing middle class. And then at the bottom, we still have the urban poor and the serfs. But nonetheless, a growing middle class is something that starts in earnest after the recovery from the Black Death. And this is also a major trigger to the Renaissance, just the spiked population and this increase of wealth. Um, the early beginnings of the middle class also took shape as Europe started to join in with long distance trade. So once Europe hooks up more with the Byzantine Empire and empires farther east, the middle class grows along with it. And social structures towards the High Middle Ages and towards the end of the High Middle Ages become more fluid. So there's more emphasis on economics instead of just Christian ideals or one status in the feudal ladder, right? There are abilities to move in and out of social classes that there were not during the early Middle Ages. So that's significant, and that will only have future ramifications once we get closer to all the revolutions that break out in the modern era. Another major change we're experiencing. I thought I had, oh, I do, never mind. Okay, I'm talking to myself. Here we go. So we have major population changes as well. I thought this was all about agricultural change, but I lied. Um, when the Viking raids end in the 10th century, the population starts to recover. So because of that, you start to see improved agricultural methods because there is an increased demand for food. This results in an agricultural surplus, and what this does is it makes towns grow. And with the growth of towns, we have the growth of markets, and markets start to meet more frequently. Oftentimes, in more medieval eras, markets only were open 1 day a week. But once you have the increased product and the increased demand, you have essentially people able to shop virtually all days of the week, right? So this also spikes the demand for more labor on manors. This happens particularly after the plague because so many people die. So actually serfs get more bargaining power after the plague is over because they can sort of shop around for whoever's going to pay them the most. And in some instances, they could actually, not just serfs, but middle class people, maybe people from noble families that were not firstborn, right, because of primogeniture. The deaths that occurred in the Black Plague actually offered a lot of social and economic opportunities for those that survived. So the people that stuck around were able to kind of take advantage of that huge void that was left behind. In around 1300 CE, a period called the Little Ice Age ended, and that allowed for a longer growing season and further population increase. The Hanseatic League, an important example of economic alliances before we have a ton of political centralization. This is in Northern Europe. So a series of cities in northern Germany, as well as the Scandinavian states, so all these trading places in the Baltic Sea, end up allying together, and they together control trade in the North and Baltic Seas, right? So it's places like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, these Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, parts of Western Russia, right, and also northern Germany, Poland. All these places are involved in the Hanseatic League. One of the things they do is they drive pirates out of the region, and they also monopolize trade in goods such as timber, grain, leather, and salted fish. So these League ships would leave the Baltic and North Seas and round the Atlantic coast of Western Europe, proceeding to the ports of the Mediterranean, where they then picked up valuables from Arab caravans. So even though this was a trading league that was from Northern Europe, they definitely made their way to the Mediterranean and traded with very far off places. So they represent a very powerful economic body in the medieval era. The League lasted until the mid-17th century when national governments became strong enough to protect merchants. So this is basically the answer to economic regulation before you have centralized government. That's what the Hanseatic League is. In terms of other economic management, we see another example at the local level with guilds. Right, so a guild is sort of like a union, right? But unions obviously aren't around yet. And the purpose of them is for people of the same occupation to join together, right? Guilds form in towns, and you have one guild per occupation. So let's say you have a blacksmith's guild, right? You have a weaver's guild, right? So everyone who is in your guild works for the same industry. And within that guild, you regulate different rules and regulations. You control regulations for apprenticeships. Also, if a worker was injured on the job, your guild could help the families of that injured worker. And also, you exercise quality control, right? So you wanted to make sure that your product fit a certain standard. That's also something a guild would do. As a result, the guilds had tremendous economic influence over a town, over an entire region, so they could exert tremendous pressure over a local lord or maybe even a monarch. So guilds really show us, again, the significance of how the economy was run before we get to the state level, and it shows you how skilled laborers ultimately were able to make certain products, were able to make money, were able to make their wages, right? It's an interesting comparison to unions, I think, if you're interested in that kind of thing. So, in any case, once we do have more political centralization, particularly once we get to the age of absolutism, guilds start to fall out of favor in practice. The cities were not a glamorous place in Europe during the medieval era, even though the architecture may suggest. They were very dirty, they were very unsanitary, and they were also just straight up dangerous, right? So people would dump their slop pails out their upper story windows straight into the street. Raw sewage would just be in the street. There wasn't proper drainage. This would spawn rats and fleas. And that, of course, was a major spreader of the Black Death. Also, there were constant fires because so many buildings were made out of wood. And overcrowding was a serious problem in urban areas because buildings were huddled within defensive walls most of the time. And so you wanted to live within the city walls. So there was no room to expand. So oftentimes you built up instead of out. Of course, this is far before the days of building codes, so you could have buildings collapse. It was just a bad situation all around. About 5% of the population of an entire nation, or not nation rather, but an entire kingdom, would live in a town. So this is actually a pretty distinct minority. But you're going to see that in the Italian peninsula, as well as the Low Countries, which are now the Netherlands, the urban population was more like 20% of the entire kingdom. So you see that some of these regions are already spiking in trade and developing an urban population before the Renaissance. The most common architectural feature of the later Middle Ages is the Gothic style, and we see that down here. So Gothic is really light and airy. You tend to, if you look at it from the inside, you see these very high arches, very light and airy, very large windows, and also flying buttresses tend to be major features of Gothic style buildings. These not only are an aesthetic feature, but they also are balancing the weight so that this tremendous ceiling is not going to collapse. The previous form of architecture that was normally used in the early Middle Ages was called Romanesque, so a nod back to the Roman times. This was common ever since the 11th century, and the Romanesque style, if you can see the difference, has much smaller windows, much darker, much stuffier, right? So in some ways, the birth of Gothic architecture sort of is a window into the Renaissance because things are so much lighter, right? It's almost symbolic. But nonetheless, that's an important distinction between the early and the Middle Ages. If you look at the style of architecture, you might be able to approximate when a building was built. So you should encourage your parents to take you on a European field trip so you can school them on architecture. I wish that would be convincing. Anywho, gender roles are also changing tremendously towards the end of the High Middle Ages. Women's rights actually start to erode over time, especially when patriarchal thinking and writing starts accompanying this urban movement, right? When urbanization increases, women's rights tend to decline. That's oftentimes just a generalization with overcrowding and increased competition. Women tend to have less of a role in society, less of a likelihood of inheriting property, less of a likelihood of being educated. But there are exceptions to the rule. So Christine de Pizan, who is represented in this wood carving down here, is a very important exception to that. She was Venetian, and she was highly educated for her time, college educated. And her writings challenged the notion that women could, basically the general notion was that women were not supposed to learn how to read. And she challenged that. She wrote a book called The Book of the City of Ladies, amongst other works. And in this book in particular, she was very praising of women's accomplishments, the idea that women could do anything if they set their minds to it. Sort of like a 15th century version of the feminine mystique, if you're a big women's study nerd like me. Anyway, women in religious orders, so nuns, had more opportunities to demonstrate administrative skills than most other women of their time. So basically, you had maybe more power and authority and ability to do actual work if you were a nun. But the problem was that the church itself was still a patriarchal institution. So just because you had, maybe a little bit more clout if you joined the church didn't really mean that you were equal in the playing field with men, right? Women in the church still could not be ordained as priests or become popes, for example. What else? Women sometimes, but not often, were able to join guilds. But it was very rare for women to have property rights. So if they married, anything that their family might have owned would go to their husband. If a woman was widowed, she would not necessarily inherit her husband's property. So that shows us that, by comparison, European women have far fewer rights than Muslim women at the same time. Let's talk about gender roles, and then we'll take another break. Oh, I already talked about gender roles. Blast. I don't know where my brain is today. Learning. We'll do one more slide, then take a break. How's that sound? So, in terms of learning and knowledge, we discussed this a little bit earlier, but the significance here is that almost all learning, education, knowledge rests within the church. Again, and this is because, as I mentioned in the previous videos, almost everyone outside of the church was illiterate. So most medical advances were unknown to Europeans. And the reason why that was because church authorities believed that the reason why people got sick was because they committed sins. So the church didn't really have a major interest in doing medical research. There was actually tremendous medical research done in the Middle Eastern world, but Western Europe didn't have enough contact with them. And so there was not very much medical progress in Western Europe during the medieval era. Basically, the church didn't feel like there was much of a need to look for answers if it was sin that was causing the sickness of its people. The major preservation of knowledge occurred within the church. So again, the only literate people would be scribes, monks. So basically, they would dedicate their lives to writing manuscripts and preserving texts. They would preserve, amongst other things, classical literature, so the works of people like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, Cicero. And they also would, of course, preserve the Bible itself. But again, it's important to recognize here that it wasn't just church scholars, it was also Middle Eastern scholars who preserved quite a bit of this knowledge, and then it was later translated back into European languages. Aristotle's writings were actually the foundation for most of the medieval time period. So one other example of very important literature during this time period was the Bible itself, but it was not the Bible as we tend to think of it. It was called the Vulgate Bible, which was a Latin Bible. It was actually translated from the older Latin. The Vulgate Bible was translated during the Roman Empire, and it's important because it's a more updated form of Latin. What's interesting about this is that the fact that the more updated version of the Bible was still a Latin Bible shows us that the church still definitely has quite a ways to go in terms of spreading its knowledge to its entire group of followers, rather. That doesn't happen until the Protestant Reformation, when Bibles start being translated into the vernacular. So we see that despite the fact that the Bible is significant, it's not really accessible to the vast majority of the population. All right, so let's take another break here. I think we can get the rest of this done in one more video. This is a pretty long segment, so stay tuned.